Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in OCR A-level history. We're continuing talking about Russia and its rulers, focusing this lesson on the post-Stalinist era and the reign of Nikita Khrushchev. This is a period that takes place from 1953 to 1964 and was seen as a very transformative period in the Soviet Union. It was a period which was marked by a shift in leadership, by ideological changes, and by attempts at trying to make significant reforms, as well as the emergence of domestic and foreign policies. Of course, the most significant figurehead during this era was that of Nikita Khrushchev, who became the de facto leader following the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, and the government of this period sought to distance itself from the repressive policies of the Stalinist regime. And so beginning first then, there was an interim period that Nikita Khrushchev would have to struggle to try and rise to power. And this is sort of between 1953 and 1954, and then sort of pushing ourselves into 1955. So we know already that Stalin dies in 1953, and the Soviet Union, as a result of this, enters into a period known as the collective leadership. By 1955, however, Nikita Khrushchev had emerged as the dominant figurehead of the Communist Party and consolidated his power through political maneuvering. The consolidation of power took place as Khrushchev began to gradually outmaneuver his rivals. The main rival was probably Lavrentiy Beria, who was the head of the NKVD, the secret police. Beria was executed in December 1953, and then it was only until we see in 1956 that Khrushchev's leadership is solidified. This is after the secret speech of 1956, where Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin's cult of personality and the excesses of the purge. We can see that sort of from a statistical period and from a statistical standpoint, during Stalin's rule, it is estimated that around 1.5 to 2 million people were executed, with the additional of millions being sent to labor camps. The years of the purges of 1936 and 1938 were often marked by the arrests and the executions of hundreds of thousands within the Communist Party and just ordinary citizens. Khrushchev then, by contrast, aimed to reduce the amount of state violence and to reassert the legitimacy of the party. That's supposed to say de-stalinization and the Thor. I'm too used to writing the word law in all of my lessons because I teach a lot of law, but that's supposed to say Thor, T-H-A-W. This was a period between 1953 and 1957, and as I've mentioned, the secret speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, which took place in 1956, condemned Stalin's totalitarian methods, his mass purges, and the role of execution of the loyal party members. This is a speech that was performed by Nikita Khrushchev and is often seen as the beginning of the thaw, a period marked by a slight relaxation of political repression. We can see that the actual practical results of the thaw and the results of de-Stalinization was that Khrushchev would release millions of prisoners from labor camps. Between 1953 and 1961, for example, it is estimated that over 2 million people were released from forced labor camps as part of an ongoing effort to try and correct some of the injustices of the Stalinist era. In 1956 as well, we see that Khrushchev introduces something known as the amnesty program, that again was the push towards the release of political prisoners. Now, we can see that between 1953 and 1960, over 10 million individuals were either freed or had their sentences reduced during this time. So the reduction ultimately in the number of political prisoners and the general easing of the Stalinist policies were evident in both the criminal and the political spheres. The idea of political repression would fall dramatically during Khrushchev's leadership, but the Soviet Union, let's just make it very clear, still remained a very authoritarian state, and dissent was still strongly suppressed, but it's just essentially the fact that Khrushchev's position in comparison to Stalin's position shows a remarkable sense of progressive and democratic values, if you will, but it's still under the context of the Soviet Union. We're still in a situation in which you have quite a lot of authoritarian rule and dissent being strongly suppressed. It's just nowhere near as bad as it was during the reign of Joseph Stalin. From an economic perspective, then, Khrushchev sought to shift Soviet economic policy away from this idea of Stalinist centralization, and he did so by trying to promote an emphasis on consumer goods and the improving of the basic living standards of ordinary Soviet citizens. We can see this in the agricultural reforms. For example, between 1954 and 1960, we have one of Khrushchev's more major agricultural initiatives. This was the Virgin Lands Campaign, which aimed to cultivate uncultivated land in the Soviet Union's interior. This was namely in places like Kazakhstan and Siberia. The result of the Virgin Lands Campaign was that over 6 million hectares of land were cultivated, and over 25 million acres were converted to agriculture by 1960. The campaign, however, was not sustainable due to the poor soil quality and the lack of a proper infrastructure program in place, and so it ended up creating temporary growth and temporary agricultural output, but the long-term yields were lower than to be expected, and soil quality was often too poor to support successful farming, and the policy would ultimately fail in terms of increasing long-term agricultural productivity. Between 1959 and 1964, however, Khrushchev also initiated a campaign to try and expand the production of corn as a new stable crop. This became known as the Corn Campaign. However, the campaign's results were very disappointing. While the corn yields did, of course, increase, as you would imagine, focusing on corn as a new potential agricultural output, and it did increase in some areas, the overall impact on Soviet agriculture was very limited. The campaign led to crop failures in many regions. And so we can sort of conclude by thinking that agricultural production did rise during the early years of Khrushchev's rule, but by the early 1960s, the growth in the idea of these sort of crop yields began to plateau. They began to sort of level out, and grain production began to fall short of expectations. For example, in 1963, we see that grain harvests were around 97 million tons, which was below the target of 100 million tons per annum. In terms of industrialization and economic growth, we can see that a few things were introduced. Khrushchev promoted the idea of decentralization of economic planning. The State Planning Committee, Gosplan, was partially replaced by regional economic councils, and this was to try and encourage more localized control. However, this decentralization caused inefficiencies and often failed to achieve the planned targets. Khrushchev, though, did continue with the Soviet idea of the 5-year plans that were very popular under Joseph Stalin, though he did so with a greater emphasis and focus on light industry and consumer goods rather than the kind of heavy industry that was the focus of the Stalinist era. And probably for a good reason was the focus of the Stalinist era because, of course, the result of the Great Patriotic War. This shows that between 1953 and 1960, Soviet industrial production did begin to grow. It began to grow by around 60%, with particularly strong growth in sectors like construction materials, chemicals, and consumer goods. However, this was an uneven type of growth, where you have some sectors being more performative and being more successful, and other sectors, such as that of machine building, failing to meet the kind of expectations that were necessary to maintain this kind of policy. Arguably the most important event which sees the fall from power of Nikita Khrushchev was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. It's conversely, in a sort of dichotomy kind of way, dialectically, marks the peak of Khrushchev's confrontations with the West, but also one of the most critical moments in the Cold War. Now, for basic reference, the picture that we have here cited is not, in fact, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is, in fact, the launch of a Saturn V rocket, which sort of forms part of the broader Cold War conversation anyway, because, of course, that is the peak of the space race in terms of designing and engineering. As a general overview, then, we can see that the Cuban Missile Crisis takes place, like I said, in October 1962, and it was the result of the fact that the Soviet Union deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba. This led to a standoff with the United States. Of course, Cuba is just off the coast of Florida, and therefore puts nuclear weapons and nuclear warheads within very close striking distance of the United States. The event brought the world to the brink of nuclear war and led to the establishment of a blockade in which we could have seen the outbreak of World War III at that point. However, after intense negotiations, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for the US to remove missiles from Turkey and pledge not to invade Cuba in the future. There was an attempt on the part of the CIA to invade Cuba in the Bay of Pigs crisis as well, bearing that in mind, as the influence of Cuba during the Cold War is obviously quite strong in terms of its impact. But in terms of impact on Khrushchev, the Cuban Missile Crisis was seen as a failure from his perspective. While the Soviet Union maintained a strong position initially, the idea that Khrushchev was willing to back down from the confrontation was viewed as a sign of weakness by many of the party members, and this event ultimately led to his removal, or contributed at least to his removal, in 1964. And so ultimately, let's just think about his ousting in 1964. His position by 1964 had weakened due to several factors, including some of the disappointing results of economic stagnation and agricultural policies, but also the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev's style of leadership was often quite erratic, and he was facing quite a lot of criticism from both party officials and economic planners. His inability to manage the growing dissatisfaction with his policies led to a coup within the Communist Party. And that's what we see in 1964, in October 1964, he was ousted in a palace coup led by figures such as Leonid Brezhnev. His removal marked the end of the Khrushchev thaw and the beginning of a period of greater political conservatism under the premiership of Leonid Brezhnev, so sometimes known as Brezhnevism. Now, we don't talk about the Brezhnev regime, the Brezhnev era in this particular topic. There aren't many A-level history modules across any of the specifications that, or across any of the exam boards that teaches the sort of post-Khrushchev, Brezhnev, Gorbachev, and collapse era and the Yeltsin era, which I think is a real shame, because the collapse of the Soviet Union and the events that take place sort of from 1964 to 2001-ish are really important events, especially in terms of today's general political structure. But that's just me complaining about the A-level system as usual. In terms of the legacy of Khrushchev, his era witnessed a notable reduction in political repression, and that can probably be one of his longest lasting legacies in terms of the sort of the secret speech at the 20th Congress, the de-stalinization process. We can see that the number of people in forced labor camps began to drop significantly between 1953 and 1961. By 1961, there were only 1.2 million people in labor camps, compared to that of over 2 million under that of Stalin in the 1930s at its peak. From an economic perspective, while Khrushchev's agricultural policies were ultimately unsuccessful, his attempts at decentralizing the economy and promoting consumer goods did still lay the groundwork for future reforms. But it was a stagnation that was beginning to set in by the 1960s. And then finally, we can probably conclude that Khrushchev's foreign policy was marked by, specifically, Cold War tensions with the West. His policies did also, though, contribute to the space race, where the Soviet Union's achievements were very, very, very important. The idea of the space race was, of course, something that led to massive technological advancements on both sides of the conflict, from both the US and the Soviet Union perspective. But things like the Cuban Missile Crisis significantly weakened his authority.